I'm Colonel Layla Reeves, 44 years old, and I built my career from the ground up. No shortcuts, no favors, just consistency and service. For years, I backed the people I cared about, especially one man I thought I'd spend my life with. But when he tried to belittle me at his own promotion ceremony, pretending I'd never gone anywhere in my career, I made a decision that changed everything. Have you ever been dismissed, underestimated, or talked down to by someone you once gave everything to? If you have, share your story in the comments. Trust me, you're not the only one. Before I get into what happened, tell me where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to reclaim your self-respect after someone crossed the line, hit like and subscribe for more real stories about boundaries and rising back up. What happened next even he didn't see coming. I served in the Air Force for 26 years before anyone outside my command really understood what that meant. Most people hear military and think uniforms, salutes, maybe a deployment or two. They don't see the late nights reviewing personnel files, the impossible decisions about who gets promoted and who doesn't. The weight of knowing your signature can change someone's entire career. By the time I made colonel at 44, I'd earned every thread on my uniform. I'd led squadrons, managed crises, and learned that real authority whispers while insecurity shouts. So when Mason Hart sent me that message, I knew exactly what kind of man he'd become. The text arrived on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing quarterly readiness reports. Come to my promotion, it read. I want you to see what a success looks like now. Then, because subtlety was never his strength, too bad you never even made captain. I stared at my phone for a long moment, then set it down and returned to my work. Mason and I had dated 8 years ago, back when I was a major and he was still figuring out how to spell leadership. We'd met at a joint training exercise where he spent more time talking about his career trajectory than actually performing his duties. At first, I thought his ambition was attractive. Ambition in moderation can be. But Mason didn't do moderation. He treated rank like a competition, every promotion board like a personal referendum on his worth as a human being. When I made Lieutenant Colonel 2 years into our relationship, he congratulated me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. When the board results were posted, he'd spent 3 days analyzing why certain people got selected, building elaborate theories about politics and favoritism. He never once considered that maybe, just maybe, some people earned it. Our relationship ended quietly one autumn evening when I realized I was exhausted from making myself smaller so he could feel bigger. He'd made another comment about my workaholic tendencies, and I'd looked at him across the dinner table and thought, I don't want to do this anymore. The breakup was civil, almost painfully so. We divided our few shared belongings, unfollowed each other on social media, and went our separate ways. I threw myself into work, took a challenging staff position at the Pentagon, and stopped thinking about Mason Hart entirely. Until that message. I read it again, noting the assumptions baked into every word. He thought I'd stalled at captain. He thought he'd somehow surpassed me. He thought inviting me to watch him succeed would hurt. The arrogance was almost impressive. I forwarded the message to my assistant, Captain Jordan Wells, with a simple question. Do you know anything about a promotion ceremony this Friday at Balling? Jordan called me back within the hour. Ma'am, that's the one you're presiding over. Brigadier General Price asked if you'd officiate since you're in town. It's a small ceremony, mostly junior officers getting their first promotions. Who's on the list? I heard papers shuffling. Let me check. We've got 3 second lieutenants moving to first lieutenant, 2 first lieutenants making captain, and, Lieutenant Mason Hart is one of them. 01 to 02. Do you know him? I smiled despite myself. We've met. Should I ask General Price to assign someone else? No, I said. I'll be there. I arrived at the ceremony venue 90 minutes early, standard practice for any official function. The small auditorium at Balling had been set up with neat rows of chairs, a simple stage, and an American flag positioned just right of center. Sergeant Talia Moreno, the admin NCO coordinating the event, met me at the entrance with a clipboard and a nervous smile. Colonel Reeves, thank you so much for coming early. General Price wanted to make sure everything was perfect. Walk me through the order of events, Sergeant. We went over the program together. 6 promotions total, alphabetical by last name. Mason would be 4th. I'd present each officer with their new rank insignia, offer brief congratulations, and allow time for family members to participate in the pinning. Standard ceremony, nothing complicated. And the officers know who's presiding? I asked. Sergeant Moreno checked her notes. They were all notified last week, ma'am. Each received an email with your name and rank. Interesting. So Mason had known, or should have known, and invited me anyway. Either he hadn't read the email carefully, or he'd assumed there was a different Colonel Reeves somewhere in the Air Force. Both options said everything about his attention to detail. I reviewed the medals and insignia laid out on the presentation table, checked the stage setup, and retreated to a small office behind the auditorium to change into my service dress uniform. The blue fabric held its crisp lines, and the silver eagles on my shoulders caught the light as I adjusted my cover in the mirror. Through the office window, I watched families begin to arrive. Proud parents, excited children, a few civilians in business casual holding flowers and cameras. The officers themselves started filtering in, easy to spot in their service dress, faces showing various combinations of nerves and excitement. Then I saw Mason. He looked older, which made sense given that 8 years had passed. His uniform was immaculate, his posture parade ground perfect. He moved through the gathering crowd with that familiar mixture of confidence and performance, shaking hands, laughing too loudly at someone's joke. When he spotted me through the window, his expression shifted. I watched him excuse himself from his conversation and make his way to where I stood near the entrance. He didn't know yet. The uniform is the same for all officers, and at a distance, eagles can look like any number of insignia. Layla. He said my name like we were old friends reuniting, not two people who hadn't spoken in years. Didn't expect you to actually show up. Thought you'd feel weird about it. I kept my expression neutral. Congratulations, Mason. He grinned, and there it was, that edge of superiority I remembered too well. Crazy, right? Me outranking you now. Never thought I'd see the day. The certainty in his voice was staggering. He genuinely believed he'd surpassed me, that his promotion to first lieutenant somehow elevated him above wherever he imagined I'd landed. Part of me wanted to correct him immediately, to watch his face change as reality settled in. But that would be petty, and more importantly, unnecessary. The truth would reveal itself soon enough. I excused myself before he could continue, citing ceremony preparations. He nodded, still wearing that insufferable smile, and returned to his family. I watched him point in my direction, watched him say something that made his mother pat his arm proudly. Whatever story he was telling about us, about my career, about this moment, it was about to be comprehensively revised. The auditorium filled gradually. I counted roughly 80 people in attendance, a decent turnout for a Friday afternoon ceremony. The promoting officers sat in the front row, Mason third from the left, his posture suggesting he thought good posture could substitute for actual leadership experience. At 1300 hours exactly, Sergeant Moreno gave me the signal. I stepped out of the office and positioned myself backstage, out of sight. The ceremony began with the national anthem, everyone rising, hands over hearts. Then General Price took the podium to offer brief opening remarks about service, dedication, and the responsibilities that come with each new rank. His speech was mercifully concise, maybe 4 minutes total. Then came the moment I'd been waiting for. General Price smiled and gestured toward the stage entrance. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my privilege to introduce our presiding officer for today's promotions. She brings 26 years of distinguished service, including deployments to 3 continents, command of 2 squadrons, and a reputation for excellence that has earned respect throughout our Air Force. Please welcome Colonel Layla Reeves. The reaction rippled through the room like a wave. I heard it before I saw it, the sharp intake of breath, the sudden whispers, the shuffle of people sitting up straighter. I walked onto the stage in full service dress, my cover squared, my eagles visible under the auditorium lights. I didn't look at Mason immediately. I looked at the audience, at the flag, at General Price, who nodded his approval. Then, naturally, inevitably, my gaze swept across the front row. Mason had gone completely still. His face had lost all color, eyes wide and unblinking. His mouth opened slightly, then closed, then opened again. No sound came out. The woman next to him, his mother, presumably looked confused by his reaction, glancing between us trying to understand the sudden tension in her son's posture. I accepted the promotion folders from Sergeant Moreno and took my position center stage. Thank you, General Price. It's an honor to be here today. My voice carried clearly through the auditorium's sound system. Promotion is not a reward for time served. It's a recognition of potential, a statement of trust, and an assumption of greater responsibility. Each officer here today has demonstrated the qualities we value most: integrity, dedication, and a commitment to serving something larger than themselves. Let's begin. The first 3 promotions proceeded smoothly. I called each name. They approached the stage. I presented their new rank insignia and offered congratulations while family members came forward for the pinning. Each interaction was warm but professional, exactly what the moment called for. Then, Second Lieutenant Mason Hart. He stood mechanically, his movements stiff and uncertain. The confidence from earlier had evaporated entirely. He walked to the stage like a man approaching his own court-martial, each step measured and reluctant. When he reached me, he stopped at attention, his eyes fixed somewhere over my left shoulder. Up close, I could see his hands trembling slightly at his sides. I opened the presentation folder and removed the first lieutenant bars, holding them where both he and the audience could see. Lieutenant Hart, I said, my voice even and clear, you are hereby promoted to the rank of First Lieutenant in the United States Air Force, effective this date. Wear this rank with honor, integrity, and dedication to the service and the airmen you'll lead. Congratulations. I extended the insignia toward him. He took them with shaking hands, barely managing to maintain eye contact. Thank you, ma'am, he whispered, the words barely audible. His mother approached the stage for the pinning, her expression still confused but proud. She removed his second lieutenant bars and replaced them with the new ones, then stepped back to take a photo. Mason stood frozen throughout, his face a careful mask that couldn't quite hide his shock. The ceremony continued. 2 more promotions, 2 more families celebrating. When the last officer had been pinned and photographed, General Price returned to the podium for closing remarks. I stood to the side, hands clasped behind my back, and watched the audience. Several people kept glancing at Mason, clearly noting his unusual stillness, the way he seemed to be processing something catastrophic. After General Price concluded his remarks and dismissed everyone, the auditorium erupted into celebration. Families swarmed the newly promoted officers, cameras flashed, and the noise level jumped from solemn to chaotic in seconds. I remained on stage, accepting congratulations from several senior NCOs and fielding questions from a captain who wanted advice about squadron command. Through it all, I tracked Mason peripherally. He stood slightly apart from his family, his new rank freshly pinned, looking like he wanted the floor to open and swallow him whole. His mother kept trying to pull him into photos, but his smile was ghastly, his eyes distant. Jordan Wells found me after about 20 minutes, tablet in hand with the post-ceremony paperwork that needed my signature. That went well, ma'am. Very dignified. Thank you, Captain. Although, Jordan hesitated, then continued carefully. Lieutenant Hart seems to be having some kind of crisis. Is there anything I should know? Nothing that concerns you or the ceremony. Everything was conducted appropriately. Jordan nodded, accepting the boundary. General Price wants to thank you personally before you leave, if you have a moment. I signed the necessary documents, then allowed Jordan to escort me to where General Price stood speaking with several of the promoted officers' family members. He saw me approaching and excused himself, extending his hand. Layla, thank you again for doing this. I know your schedule is demanding. It was my pleasure, sir. They're good young officers. Most of them. His expression suggested he'd picked up on something. I understand you and Lieutenant Hart have history? We dated briefly years ago. It ended amicably. Amicably enough that he invited you to a ceremony? I chose my words carefully. He invited me under certain assumptions about my career trajectory. Those assumptions were incorrect. General Price's eyes crinkled with understanding. I see. Well, whatever personal dynamics exist, you handled everything perfectly. Professional, dignified, exactly what these ceremonies should be. We spoke for a few more minutes about upcoming command changes and a strategic planning session scheduled for the following month. When we finished, I made my way toward the exit, ready to return to the endless stack of work waiting at my office. Colonel Reeves. I turned. Mason stood 5 feet away, somehow both at attention and completely disheveled despite his perfect uniform. His mother had apparently given up trying to engage him and was speaking with other families across the room. Lieutenant Hart. Could I? He swallowed hard. Could I speak with you privately? Just for a moment. I considered declining. I had legitimate work waiting, and nothing required me to make this easier for him. But something in his expression suggested this was important to him, and whatever our history, the man deserved a chance to speak. Briefly, I led him to the same small office where I'd changed earlier. It was quiet, removed from the celebration in the main auditorium. I closed the door and turned to face him, maintaining professional distance. Mason opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. You outrank me. It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. Yes. By how much? For grades. I made Colonel 3 years ago. He processed this information like someone working through a difficult equation. When I invited you, when I said those things about you never making captain, I was already a lieutenant colonel, I finished. I made captain at 29, major at 35, lieutenant colonel at 39, and colonel at 41. The numbers seemed to physically hurt him. He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again. Why didn't you tell me? You didn't ask, I said simply. You assumed. You assumed my career had stalled, that I'd somehow failed, that you had surpassed me. You built an entire narrative without ever checking if it was true. I thought, he stopped himself. I don't know what I thought. That you'd stayed a captain, maybe? That you'd left the service. I don't know. You thought what made you feel superior, I said, not unkindly but not softening the truth either. You needed to believe you'd won something. He flinched. That's not fair. Isn't it? Mason, you invited me here specifically to show off, to prove something about your success and my supposed failure. You sent me a message designed to hurt. And you did all of that without knowing anything about my actual career. The silence stretched between us. Outside, I could hear muffled laughter, the sounds of families celebrating. In here, there was only uncomfortable truth. I'm sorry, he finally said. For what I said in the message. For assuming. He gestured helplessly. For all of it. Apology noted. Is that all? He looked genuinely lost. What else do you want me to say? We haven't spoken in 8 years, Mason. You reached out not to reconnect, not to genuinely celebrate your achievement, but to gloat over what you thought was my failure. I'm not angry about it. I'm disappointed that you're still the same person who needed to make me smaller to feel bigger. I'm not, he stopped, seemed to reconsider. Maybe I am. I don't know. I softened slightly, seeing genuine confusion in his face. Rank isn't the measure of a person's worth. It's responsibility, it's trust earned, but it's not who you are. The fact that you tied so much of your identity to it, that you measured our entire relationship by it, that's the real problem. Not the bars on your shoulder, but what you think they mean about you. I thought if I could just make lieutenant, then captain, then major. I thought it would finally feel like enough. The admission was raw, almost painful to hear. And now? Now I'm a first lieutenant who just got pinned by a colonel he used to date, who he insulted via text message, and I feel like the smallest person in the building. Good, I said, and his eyes widened. Not because I want you to suffer, but because humility might be the first honest thing you've felt about rank in years. You're a first lieutenant now, Mason. That means you're responsible for airmen who will look to you for leadership. If you spend your time worrying about whether you're important enough, impressive enough, high-ranking enough, you'll fail them. But if you focus on doing the job well, on being someone worth following, the rest takes care of itself. He looked at me with something like wonder, as if seeing me clearly for the first time in our entire relationship. You really believe that? I've lived it for 26 years. Yes, I believe it. Mason nodded slowly. Can I ask, did you ever think about reaching out? After we broke up? No, I answered honestly. I spent about 6 months processing everything, then I moved forward. You were part of my past, but not someone I needed in my future. That's fair. He took a breath. Is there any chance we could stay in touch? Not romantically, he added quickly. I think I could learn from you. I considered it carefully. There was sincerity in his question, but also the reality that some relationships serve their purpose and end. Trying to resurrect something, even as friendship, often just delays the necessary letting go. I don't think that's a good idea, I said finally. Not because I wish you ill, but because you need to grow into your rank without me as a measuring stick. Find mentors in your unit, people who can guide you without the baggage of our history. Learn to lead because it matters, not because you're trying to prove something to me or yourself. I understand. He straightened slightly, found some dignity and acceptance. Thank you for doing the ceremony. For being professional even though I didn't deserve it. You earned the promotion, Mason. Whatever else is true, you met the requirements and you're moving forward in your career. Be proud of that. Just don't let it define you. I opened the door, signaling the conversation's end. Mason lingered for just a moment, then nodded and walked past me back toward the auditorium. I watched him rejoin his mother, saw him manage a more genuine smile as she pulled him into a hug. Whatever he felt right now, at least it was real. Jordan intercepted me before I could leave the building. Everything all right, ma'am? Everything's fine, Captain. Let's head back to the office. Actually, ma'am, General Price wanted me to tell you you're done for the day. His orders. He said you've been working 14-hour days for 3 weeks, and if you step foot in the office before Monday morning, he'll write you up for disobeying a direct order. I couldn't help but smile. The general said that? His exact words were more colorful, but that was the gist. Then I suppose I'm taking the evening off. I drove home as the afternoon sun started its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. My apartment was quiet, exactly as I'd left it that morning, coffee mug in the sink, briefcase by the door, the organized simplicity of someone who spends more time at work than home. I changed out of my service dress, hung it carefully in the closet, and stood for a moment looking at my reflection in the bedroom mirror. 44 years old, 26 years of service, a colonel with command responsibilities that kept me awake some nights. But also, whole, independent, secure in who I'd become. Mason's message had been designed to hurt me, to make me feel less than. Instead, it had reminded me how far I'd come, how much I'd earned, and how little I needed external validation to know my own worth. My phone buzzed with a text from Jordan. Lieutenant Hart just sent a follow-up email to admin. Asked if there was any feedback from the ceremony or his performance. Very professional tone. Thought you'd want to know. I smiled. Maybe he was learning already. Or maybe he was just good at appearances. Time would tell. I poured myself a glass of wine, settled onto my couch, and pulled up the stack of reading I'd been neglecting: leadership journals, strategic analyses, the kind of professional development that never really stops regardless of your rank. My career didn't define me, but it was part of who I was, woven into my identity in ways both complex and simple. Mason had invited me to his promotion thinking he'd finally achieved something that would eclipse me. What he'd actually done was remind me of everything I'd built while he was busy keeping score. The irony was almost perfect. Outside my window, the city moved through its evening rhythms, cars passing, people walking dogs, life continuing in all its mundane beauty. And somewhere in that same city, a newly promoted first lieutenant was hopefully learning that rank without character is just jewelry, authority without integrity is just noise. I hoped he'd figure it out. I genuinely did. But whether he did or didn't, my path continued forward, built on 2 decades of choices that prioritized substance over show, leadership over posturing, service over ego. Mason Hart would have to find his own way. I already had mine. The promotion ceremony felt like a lifetime ago already, fading into just another professional duty completed, another item checked off an endless list. But before I let it go entirely, I allowed myself one moment of satisfaction. When he'd said, "I give the orders here," all those years ago during one of our last arguments, implied I didn't understand command because I was too soft, too consensus-driven. I hadn't argued. I'd simply ended the relationship and proved him wrong through 2 decades of increasingly complex leadership challenges. And today, when he stood on that stage trembling, finally understanding the gap between us, it wasn't because I'd orchestrated some elaborate revenge. It was simply because I'd shown up, done my job, and let the truth speak for itself. Sometimes that's the cleanest kind of justice. Not dramatic confrontation, not verbal sparring, just the quiet revelation of reality. I finished my wine, made myself a simple dinner, and settled in for a rare evening at home. Monday would bring new challenges, new decisions, new airmen depending on my leadership. But tonight, I was just Layla Reeves, Colonel, United States Air Force, comfortable with who I'd become and curious about who I'd grow into next. Mason's promotion had happened. He was a first lieutenant now, with all the responsibilities that entailed. Whether he rose to meet them was up to him. My role in his story had concluded years ago. The rest was his to write. A month passed before I thought about Mason again. The days filled with the usual cascade of responsibilities, briefings, personnel decisions, coordination meetings that stretched past their allotted time. I reviewed promotion packages for officers who actually deserved advancement, mediated disputes between squadron commanders, and represented my wing at a Pentagon working group on readiness standards. Life continued in its demanding, purposeful rhythm. The memory of the ceremony existed somewhere in my mental filing system, categorized and stored with hundreds of other professional experiences. Not forgotten, but not actively considered either. Then Jordan knocked on my office door one afternoon with an odd expression. "Ma'am, you have an email from First Lieutenant Mason Hart." It came through official channels, addressed formally. "Do you want me to screen it first?" I considered, then shook my head. "I'll read it myself." "Thank you, Captain." The email was brief, the subject line simply, "Thank you, ma'am." I opened it. "Colonel Reeves, I wanted to reach out 1 month after my promotion ceremony to thank you again for presiding. I also wanted you to know that our conversation that day affected me deeply. I've been working with Captain Jordan Wells. He's been generous enough to mentor me despite having no obligation to do so, and I'm trying to approach my duties differently. Less ego, more service. I'm not writing to ask for anything or to reestablish contact. I simply wanted you to know that your words mattered. I'm trying to grow into my rank instead of just wearing it. Respectfully, First Lieutenant Mason Hart." I read it twice, looking for hidden agendas or subtle manipulations. But the language was straightforward, almost humble. If he'd written it to impress me, he'd have said more. The brevity suggested sincerity. I closed the email without responding. Not out of cruelty, but because some moments need to stand alone, uncluttered by further communication. He'd said thank you. I'd heard it. That was enough. Jordan appeared in my doorway again. "Ma'am, did you want me to draft a response?" "No response necessary, Captain. But I appreciate you taking time to mentor Lieutenant Hart. That speaks well of you." Jordan looked pleased. "He's rough around the edges, but he's trying. Asked me last week how to handle a conflict between 2 airmen in his section. Actually listened to the answer instead of just waiting for his turn to talk. That's progress. He mentioned you, actually. Said you'd told him something about humility being more valuable than promotion. I think it stuck with him." I nodded, turning back to the memorandum on my desk. "Some lessons take time. Let me know if he becomes a problem, otherwise handle it as you see fit." "Will do, ma'am." The conversation ended, but it planted something in my mind, a curiosity about whether people can actually change, whether one difficult moment can catalyze genuine growth. I'd seen it happen occasionally in my career, junior officers who started entitled and gradually developed into solid leaders. But I'd also seen the opposite, people who learned to perform humility without ever actually feeling it. Time would reveal which category Mason occupied. A week later, I attended a change of command ceremony at Andrews Air Force Base. The outgoing commander was someone I'd worked with during my major years, a sharp officer who'd earned every accolade on his uniform. The ceremony was more elaborate than Mason's promotion had been. Full honor guard, ceremonial sword presentation, speeches from flag officers. During the reception afterward, I found myself in conversation with Brigadier General Leonard Price, the same officer who'd asked me to preside over Mason's ceremony. "Layla, good to see you. How's the wing treating you?" "Staying busy, sir. The readiness numbers are solid, but we're fighting the usual budget constraints. Aren't we all?" He sipped his champagne, then added casually, "I heard you had a personal connection to one of the lieutenants at that ceremony last month." "The Hart kid." I kept my expression neutral. "We dated briefly years ago." Ancient history. He's been asking questions about command track positions, trying to fast-track his way to captain. I felt a familiar disappointment settle in my chest. Is he qualified? Not particularly. He's adequate at his current job, but nothing exceptional. My chief of staff thinks he's more interested in the rank than the responsibility. That sounds like Mason. General Price studied me carefully. You want me to redirect his ambitions? No, sir. He'll either figure it out or he won't. But I'd appreciate you not giving him any special consideration based on his connection to me. Let him rise or fall on his own merits. That's my default setting anyway, but good to know. He glanced across the reception area where several officers were engaged in animated conversation. You know, when I asked you to preside over that ceremony, I didn't know about your history with Hart. My staff just pulled your name as a local 06 with availability. Would you have declined if you'd known in advance? I thought about it honestly. Probably not. It needed to be done, and personal discomfort isn't a valid reason to avoid duty. That's why you're wearing eagles, he said approvingly. A lot of officers would have found an excuse. The reception continued around us, but I found myself thinking about Mason again, not with affection or even lingering resentment, but with a kind of resigned understanding. He was still chasing rank like it would solve something internal, still believing the next promotion would finally make him feel adequate. Some patterns run deep. I stayed at the reception for exactly as long as protocol required, then made my excuses and drove back to my office. The sun was setting, painting the sky in those particular shades of purple and orange that only appear in late spring. The base was quiet, most personnel already gone for the evening. My office felt like a sanctuary, organized, purposeful mine. I sat at my desk and pulled up the strategic planning document I'd been working on for the past 2 weeks. It was detailed work, requiring attention to resource allocation, personnel projections, and operational requirements across multiple fiscal years. The kind of work that had no immediate glory, but determined whether missions succeeded or failed years down the line. This was what rank actually meant at the senior levels: endless responsibility, complex decisions, and the knowledge that every choice rippled through hundreds of lives. Mason was still thinking about rank as achievement. I'd moved past that years ago, into the space where rank was simply the authority needed to accomplish important work. The recognition was nice, the pay increase welcome, but the essence was service, not status. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. How was the ceremony? I'd mentioned attending the change of command, but hadn't provided details. Went well. Long speeches, good food, the usual. You sound tired, honey. Taking care of yourself? As much as the job allows. That means no. I'm in town next week for a doctor's appointment. Let me take you to dinner. I smiled despite my fatigue. My mother had an uncanny ability to sense when I needed grounding. I'd like that. Let me know when and where. Will do. Love you. Love you too, Mom. I set the phone aside and returned to my work, but something had shifted. The interaction with General Price, combined with my mother's check-in, created a moment of clarity. I'd spent 8 years building a career that would have been unimaginable to the major who'd dated Mason Hart. I'd commanded squadrons, shaped policies, and earned respect from officers decades into their own service. And somewhere in all that achievement, I'd forgotten to take satisfaction from it. Not because I was unhappy, but because I was always looking ahead to the next challenge, the next responsibility, the next problem requiring solution. Mason's ceremony had been jarring not because it revealed anything new about him, but because it forced me to acknowledge how far I'd traveled. The woman he dated would have been hurt by his message. The colonel I'd become barely registered it as significant. That kind of growth doesn't happen loudly. It accumulates in quiet moments, difficult decisions, and the steady accumulation of experience. I worked until 1900 hours, then packed my briefcase and headed home. The drive was familiar, almost meditative, the same route I'd taken hundreds of times, past the same landmarks, through the same intersections. Normal life continuing while careers rose and fell, relationships ended and began, time moving forward with indifferent consistency. My apartment welcomed me with its usual silent comfort. I changed clothes, made a simple dinner, and settled onto my couch with a book I'd been trying to finish for 3 months. The text was dense, academic analysis of joint force integration, but I found it fascinating in the way only other military strategists would understand. Around 2100 hours, my phone rang. Unknown number, but the area code was local. I answered cautiously. Colonel Reeves. Ma'am, this is First Lieutenant Hart. I apologize for calling your personal number. I got it from the recall roster. I know this is inappropriate, but I needed to speak with you. I sat up straighter, instantly alert. Lieutenant, this is highly irregular. If you have official business, route it through proper channels. I will, ma'am. I heard that General Price asked you about me. About my questions regarding command track. So that was making the rounds already. General Price and I discussed many topics, Lieutenant. I don't recall our conversation being classified. I wanted you to know I'm not trying to use our connection. I haven't mentioned knowing you to anyone in my chain of command. I've been trying to do this the right way. Then why are you calling me at home? The question hung in the air. I heard him breathing, heard what sounded like traffic in the background. He was calling from outside, probably walking, needing to say something he couldn't say from his office or home. Because I don't know if I'm fooling myself, he finally said. I've been working with Captain Wells, trying to be better, trying to focus on the mission instead of my ego. But then I heard myself asking about command positions, and I thought, am I just performing? Am I actually changing, or am I just getting better at looking like I've changed? The honesty was unexpected. I softened my tone slightly. Lieutenant, personal growth isn't a linear process. You'll have moments of genuine progress and moments where you backslide into old patterns. The question isn't whether you occasionally think about advancement. That's natural. The question is why you want it and what you'll do with it when you get it. How do I know the difference? You probably won't. Not clearly, not for years. But the fact that you're questioning yourself, that you're worried about your motivations, that's actually a good sign. The officers who never examine their ambitions are the ones who become toxic leaders. So I should just keep going? Keep trying. That's all any of us can do. There's no epiphany, no single moment where everything clicks and you suddenly become the leader you want to be. It's daily choices, repeated efforts, and occasionally recognizing you've grown when you didn't even notice it happening. Can I ask you something personal, ma'am? I hesitated. You can ask. I may not answer. When did you know you were ready for Colonel? Like, really ready, not just technically qualified. I thought back to my own lieutenant colonel years, the gnawing uncertainty about whether I could handle the increased responsibility. I didn't know, I admitted. I got the promotion, pinned on the Eagles, and spent the first 6 months terrified I was going to catastrophically fail. But I did the work anyway, made decisions even when I wasn't certain, and gradually realized competence isn't about never doubting yourself. It's about functioning despite the doubt. That actually helps, ma'am. Thank you. Lieutenant, you need to hang up now and not call this number again unless there's a genuine emergency. Clear? Yes, ma'am. Crystal clear. And ma'am, I really am trying. I know you are. Good night, Lieutenant. I ended the call and sat in the quiet of my living room, processing the conversation. Mason was struggling, genuinely it seemed, with the gap between who he'd been and who he wanted to become. That struggle was worth something, even if the outcome remained uncertain. I made a note to mention the call to Jordan Wells, not as a reprimand but as context. Jordan was doing good work mentoring Mason, and he deserved to know the full picture. The next morning, I arrived at my office to find a stack of promotion packages waiting for review. 23 officers up for consideration, each packet containing evaluations, performance reports, and recommendation letters. This was the quiet machinery of the Air Force, the system that determined who advanced and who plateaued. I spent 4 hours reviewing each package carefully, making notes about strengths and weaknesses, comparing officers against the published standards. 3 of the candidates were clearly exceptional, strong performers with consistent records and proven leadership. 5 were adequate but unremarkable. The rest fell somewhere in between. When I reached the final package, I recognized the name. First Lieutenant Sarah Martinez, someone I'd worked with briefly 2 years ago. She'd been a second lieutenant then, eager but unrefined. Her current evaluations showed remarkable growth, strong ratings, specific examples of initiative and leadership, enthusiastic recommendations from her chain of command. I wrote a positive endorsement and moved her packet to the Recommend Promote stack. This was how the system worked when it functioned properly. Officers who performed well, who grew into their responsibilities, who demonstrated the Air Force's core values, they advanced. Officers who stagnated or who prioritized self-interest over service, they plateaued. Mason would find his place in that spectrum eventually. Where he landed was entirely up to him. Jordan knocked and entered with my morning briefing. Ma'am, quick heads up, Lieutenant Hart called me last night. Said he'd spoken with you and wanted to apologize for crossing boundaries. I told him to put it in writing and route it through me. He did. The memo's in your inbox. Very professional. Thank you, Captain. I was going to mention the call. He's learning, Jordan said. Slowly, but he's learning. Yesterday, he asked me how to give constructive feedback to an underperforming airman without destroying the kid's confidence. That's the kind of question good leaders ask. Keep working with him. But Jordan, I made sure he met my eyes. Don't let him use you as a backdoor to my attention. If he needs something from me, it goes through official channels or not at all. Understood, ma'am. I've been careful about that. The day continued in its usual pattern of meetings, phone calls, and decision-making. I briefed the wing commander on our readiness posture, attended a working group on personnel retention, and reviewed a draft policy on professional military education requirements. Normal work for a normal Thursday. But throughout the day, I found myself thinking about the trajectory of a career, how it's built through thousands of small moments, each choice compounding over time. Mason's promotion ceremony had been one moment in his career and mine. For him, it was a jarring realization about how badly he'd misjudged our relative positions. For me, it was a reminder of everything I'd built through consistent effort and genuine dedication to service. Neither of us would remember it the same way, and both perspectives were valid from where we stood. That evening, I met my mother for dinner at a small Italian restaurant near her hotel. She looked good, healthy, energetic, more relaxed than I'd seen her in months. We ordered wine and pasta and spent the first 20 minutes catching up on family news and her recent travels. Then she asked, with the directness only mothers can manage, "What's bothering you, honey? You look tired." "Just work." "It's always work. It's never just work with you." "What happened?" I found myself telling her about Mason's ceremony, about the message he'd sent, about the awkward confrontation afterward. My mother listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from curiosity to understanding to something almost sad. When I finished, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You know what strikes me most about that story?" she asked. "What?" "That you handled it perfectly. You didn't gloat, didn't humiliate him publicly, didn't use your rank as a weapon. You just did your job and let reality speak for itself. That's real maturity, Layla. I'm 44 years old, Mom. I should be mature by now. You'd be surprised how many people reach middle age without learning that lesson. Your father never did." She rarely mentioned my father, who'd left when I was 12. He always needed to be the smartest person in the room, the most successful, the most impressive. It exhausted him and everyone around him. You're nothing like that. Some days I worry I'm too focused on work, that I've sacrificed too much for the career. My mother shook her head firmly. You've made choices, Layla. Conscious choices about what matters to you. That's not sacrifice, that's integrity. You wanted to serve, to lead, to make a difference. You've done all of that. Don't let some ex-boyfriend's insecurity make you question your path. He's not making me question it. I struggled to articulate the feeling. Sometimes I wonder if I've become too hard, too focused on the mission at the expense of connections. Did you show Mason any kindness during your conversation? I tried to. I gave him honest feedback, told him he could grow. Then you're not too hard. You're appropriately calibrated for your responsibilities. The Air Force needs leaders who can be firm and fair simultaneously. That's exactly what you are. We finished our dinner talking about lighter topics, her upcoming vacation, a book she'd just finished, my plans to finally repaint my apartment. By the time we said goodbye in the parking lot, I felt steadier, more grounded in my choices. "Come visit me soon," my mother said, pulling me into a hug. "Don't wait for Christmas. Just show up one weekend." "I'll try, Mom." No promises, but I'll try. That's all I ask. I drove home feeling grateful for her perspective, for the reminder that my career wasn't a deviation from life, but an expression of who I'd chosen to become. 3 months after the ceremony, I received orders to attend a strategic planning conference in Colorado Springs. 2 weeks of intensive discussions about Air Force priorities, resource allocation, and long-term force structure. The kind of assignment that was intellectually stimulating, but physically exhausting. I flew out on a Sunday evening, checked into the hotel, and spent Monday morning reviewing conference materials. The attendees were mostly O5s and OSIXS, with a few O7s sprinkled in for senior leadership perspective. We divided into working groups based on functional expertise, and I found myself assigned to the personnel and readiness track. The discussions were sharp, occasionally contentious, always focused on real problems without easy solutions. How do you retain quality officers in a competitive job market? How do you balance operational tempo with family stability? How do you develop future leaders while meeting current mission demands? These questions had no simple answers, but the quality of the debate was exceptional. On the third day, during a coffee break, I overheard a captain mentioning Lieutenant Hart in conversation with another officer. I didn't intend to eavesdrop, but they were standing close enough that their words carried. Hart's been different lately, the captain said. Less focused on his next promotion, more engaged with his actual job. Jordan Wells has been mentoring him, and it shows. Thank God, the other officer replied. He was insufferable 6 months ago, constantly talking about his career timeline, comparing himself to other lieutenants. I thought he was going to be one of those toxic climbers. He still has moments, but yeah, significant improvement. Whatever happened, something knocked him down a few pegs in a good way. I moved away before they noticed me listening, but the conversation stayed with me. Maybe Mason was genuinely changing. Maybe that one moment of stark reality had been enough to shift his trajectory. Or maybe he'd just gotten better at hiding his ambitions. Either way, it wasn't my concern anymore. The conference continued through the week, each day bringing new insights and new frustrations. By Friday, I was mentally drained but satisfied with the work we'd accomplished. The final recommendations would go up the chain of command, where they'd either be implemented or filed away, depending on budget realities and political will. That evening, several of us gathered at the hotel bar for informal drinks. The conversation shifted from professional to personal, the kind of bonding that happens when military professionals let their guard down slightly. A major named Rachel Torres asked me how I balanced career and personal life, a question I'd fielded countless times. I don't balance it, I admitted. I make choices about priorities, and some things get sacrificed. That's the reality of senior leadership. Do you regret it? Someone else asked. I considered carefully. I regret specific moments, missing a friend's wedding because of a deployment, not being more present for my mother during a difficult time. But the overall path? No. I chose this, and I'd choose it again. That's refreshing honesty, Rachel said. Most senior officers give some line about work-life balance being achievable with proper time management. It's bullshit, but they say it anyway. Work-life balance is a myth at this level, I agreed. You can have work-life integration, where professional and personal identities blend together, but actual balance requires compromises I'm not willing to make. And that's okay. Not every officer needs to follow the same model. The conversation drifted to other topics, but Rachel caught me afterward. Thank you for being real about that, ma'am. I've been struggling with whether to stay in or get out, and everyone keeps telling me I can have everything. It helps to hear someone acknowledge the trade-offs. What does your gut tell you? That I love the work, hate the sacrifice, and need to decide which matters more. That's the essential question, I said. No one can answer it for you. But for what it's worth, I think you'd make an excellent major. Your analysis in the working groups was sharp. She looked genuinely pleased. Thank you, ma'am. That means something coming from you. I flew home on Saturday, exhausted but satisfied. The conference had been valuable, both professionally and personally. I'd contributed meaningfully to important discussions, connected with other senior leaders, and been reminded why I dedicated my life to this service. Sunday, I spent recovering, sleeping late, doing laundry, catching up on personal errands that had accumulated during the week. Monday morning arrived with its usual cascade of demands. Back to the office, back to the steady rhythm of command, back to making decisions that would affect hundreds of people I'd never meet. Normal service resumed. And somewhere in the same Air Force, First Lieutenant Mason Hart was presumably doing the same, showing up, doing his job, hopefully growing into the leader he'd claimed he wanted to become. Our paths had crossed briefly, awkwardly, conclusively. The ceremony was done, the message delivered, the lesson learned or not learned as the case may be. Life continued forward, as it always does, indifferent to our small dramas and private revelations. I had work to do, airmen to lead, and a career still unfolding in ways I couldn't predict. That was enough. That had always been enough. 6 months had passed since Mason's promotion ceremony when I received an unexpected email from General Price. The subject line read, "Your input requested, Officer Development." I opened it during a brief gap between meetings. "Layla, I'm putting together a panel to discuss toxic leadership and officer development for our Wing Commander Conference next month. Would you be willing to participate? The discussion will focus on identifying early warning signs of problematic behavior patterns and intervention strategies. Given your background in personnel development, I think you'd bring valuable perspective. Let me know by Friday." Len, I responded affirmatively within an hour. The topic was important, and these kinds of discussions could actually influence how the Air Force developed its officers. If I could contribute to better leadership across the force, that was time well spent. The conference was scheduled for late November at the National Defense University in Washington. I arrived early, as always, and reviewed my notes while other panelists trickled into the conference room. There were 5 of us total, 2 colonels, a brigadier general, a senior NCO with 30 years of experience, and a civilian psychologist who specialized in organizational behavior. General Price opened the session by framing the problem. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have an endemic issue in our officer corps. Not universal, but persistent. Young officers who prioritize personal advancement over mission effectiveness, who view leadership as a status symbol rather than a responsibility, who create toxic climates that drive good people out of service. We need to get better at identifying these patterns early and either correcting them or counseling officers out before they do serious damage." The psychologist, Dr. Linda Chin, spoke first. "The research shows that many toxic leaders exhibit narcissistic traits, need for admiration, sense of entitlement, lack of empathy. But here's the complication. Our promotion system sometimes selects for these very traits because they can look like confidence and ambition." "So how do we distinguish?" the Brigadier General asked. "How do we separate confident, ambitious officers from those who will become toxic leaders?" "It's not always clear-cut," Dr. Chin admitted. "But there are indicators. How do they respond to setbacks? How do they treat subordinates when no one's watching? Do they give credit to their team or hoard it? Are they interested in developing others or just advancing themselves?" I found myself thinking about Mason, how he'd responded to my promotions with resentment, how he'd treated my success as somehow diminishing his own worth. Those had been warning signs I'd recognized but hadn't named at the time. When my turn came to speak, I chose my words carefully. "I think one key indicator is how officers talk about rank. Every officer wants to advance. That's natural. But some officers talk about rank as if it's inherently valuable, as if wearing a certain insignia makes them worthwhile. Others talk about it as a tool, the authority needed to accomplish more complex missions. That distinction matters." "Can you give an example?" the senior NCO asked. "I've known officers who constantly compared themselves to peers, who measured their worth by their position on the promotion timeline, who seemed to think achieving a certain rank would solve something internal. And I've known officers who barely mentioned their own advancement, but focused intensely on preparing for higher levels of responsibility. The second group usually becomes better leaders." The Brigadier General nodded. "I've seen that pattern too. The ones who are desperate for promotion often do the worst with it once they get it. They don't know what to do with the authority because they never thought past the acquisition of it." We spent 2 hours discussing intervention strategies, mentorship approaches, and systemic changes that might help. The conversation was frank, sometimes uncomfortable, always productive. These were experienced leaders willing to acknowledge flaws in how the Air Force developed its people. During a break, General Price pulled me aside. "Your comments about rank and identity hit home. I've been thinking about young Hart, the lieutenant from the ceremony you presided over. He fits that pattern you described." "I've heard he's improving," I said carefully. "Captain Wells speaks well of his recent performance. He is improving, which is why I haven't given up on him. But he still asks me questions about command positions, career timelines, competitive advantages. The language reveals where his focus is. What are you going to do? Keep him in his current position for another year. Give him more time to mature. If he continues improving, he'll make captain on a normal timeline. If he stagnates or reverts to old patterns, the system will sort him out naturally." "That seems fair." General Price studied me. "You know, he mentions you occasionally. Not constantly, not inappropriately, but he'll reference something you said about leadership or responsibility. Whatever you told him during that private conversation, it stuck. I just gave him honest feedback. Nothing extraordinary. Sometimes that's exactly what people need, someone they can't manipulate, can't charm, who'll just tell them the truth. The conference continued through the afternoon, and by the time I flew back to base, I felt cautiously optimistic. The Air Force had problems, but it also had leaders willing to address them thoughtfully. That mattered. December brought the usual holiday season complications, reduced manning, family commitments, and the pressure to accomplish everything before the end of the fiscal year. I worked through most of December, approving leave requests while declining opportunities to take my own time off. Someone needed to maintain continuity, and I'd long since accepted that senior leadership meant sacrificing personal convenience for organizational stability. On December 23rd, I was working late at the office when Jordan Wells knocked on my door. "Ma'am, I know you said not to be disturbed, but Lieutenant Hart is here. Says he needs 5 minutes of your time. Should I send him away?" I almost said yes, then reconsidered. It was nearly the holidays, and if he'd made the effort to come here in person, maybe it was important. 5 minutes. Clock starts when he enters. Jordan showed Mason in, then closed the door behind him. Mason stood at attention, looking more nervous than I'd seen him since the ceremony. He'd lost weight, I noticed, not dramatically, but enough to suggest stress or increased physical training. "Colonel Reeves, thank you for seeing me. I know it's late and you're busy." 4.5 minutes, Lieutenant. "Say what you came to say." He took a breath. "I'm here to thank you again, properly this time, for what you said to me after my ceremony. I've spent the last 6 months trying to understand why I tied so much of my identity to rank, why I needed to feel superior to you, why your success threatened me so much. I've been working with a counselor, voluntarily, nothing official, and I'm starting to understand some of it." "That's good, Lieutenant. Personal growth is important. But you could have sent an email. I wanted to tell you in person because I owe you an apology. Not just for the message I sent inviting you to the ceremony, though that was terrible, but for every time during our relationship when I made you feel like you needed to be less so I could feel like more. You deserved better than that, and I'm sorry." The apology was unexpected in its specificity. Most people apologize vaguely, leaving the details ambiguous. Mason had named exactly what he'd done wrong. That took courage. "Apology accepted," I said. "I appreciate you coming here to say it in person. There's one more thing, ma'am. I wanted you to know that I've decided not to pursue command track positions right now. I'm going to focus on being the best flight commander I can be, on developing the airmen in my section, on actually earning the respect I used to just expect. Maybe in a few years I'll be ready for more responsibility. But right now, I'm not. That's a mature decision, Lieutenant." Captain Wells suggested it, but I agreed because I knew it was true. I'm not ready. I need more time to figure out who I am outside of what rank I wear. I looked at him carefully, trying to assess whether this was genuine transformation or just a more sophisticated performance. His body language was different, less rigid, less performative. He wasn't standing at attention trying to impress me. He was just standing there, uncomfortable but honest. "Mason," I said, using his first name for the first time since the ceremony, "I'm glad you're doing this work. Real leadership requires self-awareness, humility, and the ability to put mission and people ahead of ego. If you can develop those qualities, you'll be a good officer. If you can't, you'll plateau no matter how smart or capable you are." "I understand, ma'am." And Mason stopped thinking about me. Stop using me as a measuring stick or a reference point. I'm not your competition, not your mentor, not your standard. Find your own path, measured against your own values. Clear. Crystal clear, ma'am. Thank you. He saluted, I returned it, and he left. I sat at my desk for a long moment afterward, processing the interaction. Maybe he was changing. Maybe that one moment of humiliation had been exactly what he needed to crack through years of defensive posturing. Or maybe he'd simply gotten better at saying what people wanted to hear. Time would tell. What mattered was that I'd done my part, been honest, been fair, been clear about what real leadership required. The rest was up to him. I packed up my work, turned off my office lights, and drove home through empty streets. Most people were already on holiday leave, their offices dark, their homes full of family and celebration. I'd spend Christmas quietly, maybe visit my mother, maybe just read and rest. The solitude didn't bother me. I'd learned years ago that loneliness and aloneness were different things, and I was comfortable with the latter. My career had cost me relationships, normalcy, the kind of domestic stability most people built in their 30s and 40s. But it had given me purpose, authority, the satisfaction of leading well and contributing meaningfully. For me, that trade had been worth it. Mason was still figuring out his trades, still learning what he was willing to sacrifice and what he insisted on keeping. That journey was his alone. I'd played my small part in it, accidentally, reluctantly, but hopefully meaningfully. The rest was beyond my control or concern. Christmas came and went. The new year arrived with its usual flood of administrative tasks and strategic planning requirements. I returned to work refreshed, ready for whatever challenges awaited. And somewhere in the same Air Force, First Lieutenant Mason Hart presumably did the same, carrying forward whatever lessons he'd learned, building whatever career he'd choose to build. Our story had ended. His was still being written. Mine continued forward, one decision at a time, one responsibility at a time, one day of service at a time. That was enough. That would always be enough. I served in the Air Force for 26 years before anyone outside my command really understood what that meant. By the time I made colonel at 44, I'd earned every thread on my uniform. So when Mason Hart sent me that message inviting me to his promotion ceremony, adding that it was too bad I never even made captain, I knew exactly what kind of man he'd become. We'd dated 8 years ago when I was a major, and he was still learning how to spell leadership. He treated rank like a competition, every promotion board like a personal referendum. When I made lieutenant colonel, he congratulated me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Our relationship ended when I realized I was exhausted from making myself smaller so he could feel bigger. His message arrived while I was reviewing readiness reports. He assumed I'd stalled at captain. He never cared to ask otherwise. I forwarded it to my assistant, Captain Jordan Wells, asking about a ceremony at Balling. Jordan called back within the hour. "Ma'am, that's the one you're presiding over. Lieutenant Mason Hart is on the list, second lieutenant to first lieutenant. Do you know him?" I did. I'd be the senior officer pinning his bars. The ceremony went exactly as protocol required. When the announcer called my name and rank, the room shifted. Mason turned, his jaw slackening, blinking like the lights had blinded him. I walked forward in full service dress, accepted his insignia case, and kept my voice professional. "Lieutenant, present yourself." He straightened instantly, not because I was his ex, but because I outranked him by 4 full grades. As I pinned his bars, I said only what the moment required, wear these with honor. Afterward, he asked to speak privately. His hands trembled as he whispered, "You outrank me." My reply was steady, "I did before you invited me." He asked why I never told him. "You never asked." I gave him honest feedback about humility, about tying identity to rank instead of responsibility. He admitted he'd always thought the next promotion would solve something internal. I told him to grow into his rank, not just wear it. When he asked to stay in touch, I declined. "Not now, but I hope you grow into your rank." A month later, he sent a respectful email thanking me. I didn't respond, not out of cruelty, but closure. Some moments need to stand alone. The ceremony became a catalyst for both our careers. I attended a senior leadership course at the Air War College, where a retired 3-star general talked about the loneliness of senior command. That evening, I called my mother, questioning how much further I wanted to go. She reminded me of when I was commissioned, when I'd said I'd found what I was meant to do. The answer, when I let myself feel it, was yes. Jordan Wells was selected for Major below the zone. Mason volunteered for a troubled section nobody wanted and turned it around. I received notification of selection for the Command Leadership Program, preparation for wing commander positions. Small moments creating unexpected consequences. I assumed command of a wing in North Dakota the following July. 3,500 people, normal problems requiring sustained attention. By September, we'd made measurable progress. Then Mason emailed from his deployment in Romania. He'd counseled a second lieutenant struggling with the same issues he'd had, using my words about humility and character. I tried to give him the same gift you gave me, honest feedback delivered with enough respect that it could actually land. I broke my pattern and responded briefly, acknowledging his growth. November brought an aircraft incident that could have been catastrophic, but ended without injuries. During the investigation, my maintenance squadron commander mentioned learning crisis management from a colonel years ago who'd taught him that panic is a choice. That kind of legacy, teaching principles officers carried forward, was what real leadership built. In February, I received notification of nomination for Brigadier General. The board would meet in May. I told almost no one, focusing on current work. March brought a wing-level exercise that revealed cultural shifts I'd been building, squadron commanders engaging in honest critique without fear of punishment. This was successful leadership, steady cultivation of healthy organizational dynamics. At a conference in April, my predecessor told me what she respected most. You're not trying to revolutionize anything. You're just doing the basics extremely well. My entire career had been about mastering fundamentals, showing up, working hard, telling the truth, taking care of people. Sustained excellence over decades, nothing more complicated. In late May, Jordan messaged that Mason had made captain below the zone. Genuine transformation from insecure second lieutenant to strong junior officer. 2 weeks later, on June 19th, exactly 2 years after his ceremony, I received the call. I'd been selected for Brigadier General. 27 years of service culminating in flag officer rank. Only 4% of colonels ever made it. That evening, I thought about the path that led here. Mason's arrogant message had seemed important 2 years ago, but now felt like a footnote. He'd invited me hoping to make me feel small. Instead, he'd been forced to confront his assumptions and grew from it. I'd presided with professional detachment and moved forward. Both of us ended better than we'd been. I'd earned this promotion through sustained excellence over nearly 3 decades. The rank was just recognition of work already done. The real achievement was who I'd become while doing it. And whatever came next, I'd face it the same way I'd faced everything else, with competence, integrity, and the steady confidence that comes from knowing you've earned your place. And that's how a man who once mocked my career ended up saluting me on his big day. Life has a way of leveling people when the truth finally walks into the room. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever had someone try to tear you down just to feel bigger? Did you ever get the chance to show them who you really became? And if you had been in my shoes, would you have confronted him or stayed silent and let the rank speak for itself? Drop your stories in the comments. Someone out there needs to hear them. If this resonated with you, hit like, subscribe, and share this with anyone who's rebuilding their confidence.